It seems like you want to go deeper than just like common tourist phrases.
Yes, definitely.
So today, we're going to kind of trace the journey of how Brazilian Portuguese became its own thing.
Yeah, it's a really interesting story because a lot of people think that it's just Portuguese with a different accent.
Right, like just a few different sounds.
Right.
But it's really much more than that.
Yeah, it's a lot more than that.
Okay.
We're talking about variations in grammar, vocabulary, even the way you structure a sentence, like a whole different linguistic ecosystem.
Yeah. So where do we even begin with all this? How did Brazilian Portuguese come about?
Well, the Wikipedia article highlights some of the historical forces that were at play. Obviously, colonization brought Portuguese to Brazil, but it also encountered a diverse landscape of indigenous languages.
Right.
And then, of course, there's the influence of the slave trade, which brought even more linguistic diversity to the mix.
So it's like this really interesting kind of web of interactions that resulted in the language we know today.
Exactly.
The article mentions something called língua geral. What is that?
Língua geral, yeah. It's a fascinating example of how language and power kind of intertwined in colonial Brazil. So Jesuit missionaries, in an attempt to find a common language for this massive territory,
Right.
they developed língua geral, drawing primarily from Tupi, an indigenous language.
Wow. And that worked for a while. They were able to communicate.
For a time, yeah, especially in certain regions, but the Portuguese crown saw it as a threat to their authority.
Right, of course.
A challenge to Portuguese as the dominant language.
Well, yeah, if you want to have control over your colony, everyone needs to speak the same language.
Exactly, and ultimately the crown's efforts to establish Portuguese as the language of the colony were successful.
So what happened to this língua geral? Did it just disappear?
It did fade as a primary language for sure, but its influence is still felt in Brazilian Portuguese today. Words like Ipanema, Jacaré, those are remnants of língua geral.
Wow, so even though the language itself didn't survive, those words are like little glimpses into that chapter of history.
Absolutely, and it's not just place names.
Yeah.
A lot of words for native flora and fauna Tucano, Mandioca, Abacaxi, they all have roots in indigenous languages, primarily Tupi-Guarani.
It's incredible how those words are like woven into the fabric of the language.
Yeah, and the linguistic tapestry doesn't stop there. The transatlantic slave trade also left its own mark. Words from West African languages, especially Yoruba, are deeply embedded in Brazilian culture and language.
Like what kind of words are we talking about?
Well, food is a big one. Acarajé, moqueca. I mean, these dishes are practically synonymous with Brazilian cuisine. But, beyond food, you have words like mandinga, tied to religious concepts, and of course, samba.
Samba.
Right, which needs no introduction.
Amazing how these words travel, carrying with them these pieces of history.
Yeah, it goes to show that these influences weren't just absorbed. They became fundamentally Brazilian,
Right.
Transcending, their origins.
Right.
And that leads to a really interesting question. Is Brazilian Portuguese just a dialect, or has it become its own distinct language?
I've heard arguments on both sides.
Right.
I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah.
What does the linguistics world say?
Well, it's not a simple yes or no answer,
Okay.
which is what makes it so interesting. There are very compelling arguments on both sides,
Okay.
and it can get surprisingly heated.
Heated how?
Well, those who argue against Brazilian Portuguese being a separate language point to the fact that, Portuguese and Brazilian speakers can generally understand each other,
Right.
especially in written form. They call it mutual intelligibility.
That makes sense. So what about the other side?
Well, proponents of Brazilian Portuguese as its own language focus on something called Brazilian vernacular, which refers to the everyday spoken language. It's full of those unique grammatical structures and pronunciations we've been discussing. They argue that these features are so distinct that Brazilian vernacular has earned its own linguistic identity.
So it becomes a question of acknowledging the depth of those differences.
Exactly.
And what they say about Brazilian culture.
Right, and its desire to have its own voice separate from its colonial past language plays a huge part in shaping that identity.
For sure. It's
Yeah.
like language is a powerful symbol of a nation's journey.
Absolutely.
It's interesting how language can be such a powerful tool in those discussions.
Yeah, for sure. And speaking of independence, even within Brazil, there are variations in how closely the spoken language aligns with that formal European standard.
So there's like debate within Brazil itself about what is correct Brazilian Portuguese.
Exactly. It's this really interesting tension between upholding the rules inherited from Portugal and embracing the way the language is actually spoken on the streets.
Which, let's be real, is where a language gets a lot of its character from.
I agree. Totally. And this is where those borrowed words you mentioned earlier come into play.
Right.
Brazilian Portuguese is really this amazing fusion of influences with loan words from German, French, English, even Japanese.
I'm curious about those Japanese loan words. What kind of words are we talking about? How did those get there?
Well, many of them revolve around food and cultural concepts. You have kimono, of course, but also karaoke, yakisoba, tempuras. It really reflects the history of Japanese immigration to Brazil.
Right.
And the ways those cultures have interacted.
It's like you can trace the path of those cultural exchanges through the words themselves.
Absolutely. What about English? What kind of English words have Brazilians borrowed?
Oh, man.
I bet you can think of a few.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask you that.
Okay. Well, you have everything from tech terms like nerd and geek to words like quiche and sweet.
Kitsch. That's a good one. Yeah, I never would have thought of that. It's funny how those words become so ingrained that you almost forget that they were borrowed in the first place.
Yeah, it shows how fluid language can be.
For sure. So we've talked about the history. We've talked about the words themselves. What about the sound? The Wikipedia article mentioned something about phonetic changes that give it that musicality.
Oh, yeah.
Brazilians have that famous sing-song way of speaking. What is that about?
Well, one key element is how the vowels are pronounced. Compared to European Portuguese, vowels and Brazilian Portuguese tend to be more open and relaxed.
Okay.
Even when they're not stressed.
So, for example, the word operação.
Perfect example. In Brazilian Portuguese, you'd hear that second O with a more open, relaxed quality than you would in European Portuguese.
Interesting how one little sound can make such a difference.
Exactly. And it creates this whole different feeling to the language.
Yeah, what about nasal sounds? Those are different too, right?
Yes. Nasal vowels are very distinctive in Brazilian Portuguese, and particularly in certain dialects where the nasalization kind of intensifies towards the end of the vowel.
Oh, wow.
It's very subtle, but it contributes to that overall sound.
Interesting. So it's not just the words themselves, but it's how you say them.
Yes, exactly. And then there's the case of those syllable final S sounds, which can be a real giveaway.
Oh, yeah, I've noticed that.
It's a major source of variation even within Brazil. So in certain regions like Rio de Janeiro, those S sounds become palatalized, almost like a sh sound, especially when they come before a consonant.
So festa would sound more like festa.
Exactly. But then in other areas like São Paulo, they retain that sharper dental S sound.
Wow, so many variations within one language.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder if someone from, say, the south of Brazil would even notice those differences.
It's amazing how adaptable the human ear is.
Right.
We adjust to different accents and dialects without even realizing it. But to a trained ear, those nuances can be very telling.
That's so cool. So we've talked a lot about what's different between Brazilian Portuguese and European Portuguese, but is there anything that stayed the same? Did Brazilian Portuguese preserve any of those older forms?
That's a great question. And actually, yes, there are a few interesting examples. For instance, Brazilian Portuguese has held on to certain consonant sounds that have shifted over time in European Portuguese.
Really? Like what?
We'll take the consonants B, D, and G. In European Portuguese, these often soften into fricatives in certain positions.
Okay.
So B might sound a bit like a V, D like a TH, and G like a very soft, breathy sound. But in Brazilian Portuguese, they've generally kept their original, more distinct pronunciations.
So it's almost like these two branches of the Portuguese family tree went their separate ways and each one held on to certain things while changing others.
Exactly. And that's part of what makes studying language families so fascinating. You see these parallel paths of development, echoes of the past, alongside these innovations of the present.
It really shows that language is always evolving.
Absolutely. It's this living, breathing thing that's constantly changing.
So we've talked about sounds, we've talked about words. What about grammar? Because it's not just the sounds that set Brazilian Portuguese apart, right?
Yeah. Absolutely not. There are some very unique grammatical features as well.
I'd love to dig into that a little bit. What are some of the key differences that come to mind?
Well, one of the most fascinating areas is how Brazilian Portuguese handles pronouns.
Okay.
Those little words that can be surprisingly tricky.
Yeah, pronouns. They seem so simple on the surface, but they can get really complicated.
Oh, for sure. And in Brazilian Portuguese, they offer this really interesting window into the unique character of the language. We were talking about você earlier.
Right, how it's different from tu.
Exactly. So in a lot of Brazilian Portuguese dialects, você has basically replaced tu altogether.
Wow, so there's no more distinction between formal and informal you.
For the most part, no. And here's where it gets interesting. Você, even though it's technically a third-person pronoun, is often used with second-person verb forms.
Wait, a third-person pronoun with second-person verbs? How does that even work?
Yeah, it seems a little counterintuitive, but it's a quirk that Brazilian Portuguese handles with no problem. It's a great example of how language can kind of bend its own rules.
Exactly. That's what makes it so interesting. Yeah. What other grammatical areas do you think are really unique to Brazilian Portuguese?
Word order is another big one. Brazilian Portuguese tends to put object pronouns before the verb, something called proclisis. You see it in European Portuguese too, but it's way more common in Brazilian Portuguese.
Proclisis pronoun before the verb.
Yeah.
Give me an example. How would that change a sentence?
Okay, so let's take a simple sentence like, I see you. In Brazilian Portuguese, you'd probably say te vejo. Literally, you, I see. In European Portuguese, it would be vejo-te.
Wow. That's a pretty big difference.
It changes the whole rhythm of the sentence.
Yeah, for sure. And does this proclisis thing happen with other parts of speech too, or is it just pronouns?
It actually influences how Brazilian Portuguese uses prepositions as well.
Prepositions, like
Yeah.
to, from, with, those prepositions.
Exactly. So Brazilian Portuguese and European Portuguese have the same basic set of prepositions,
Right.
but they don't always use them in the same way.
Okay, so give me an example. What's one of those differences?
Let's take the verb chamar, which means to call. In Brazilian Portuguese, it's very common to use it with the preposition de when you're describing someone or something.
So instead of saying, I called him a genius, you would say,
Chamei ele de genio. So literally, I called him of genius.
it's interesting how these little words can change the nuance of the meaning.
Absolutely. These subtle but important differences are everywhere, and they make studying Brazilian Portuguese really interesting because you can see how the language reflects the culture.
Right.
And this kind of leads us to the whole concept of diglossia.
Diglossia. That's a good one. What is that exactly?
So diglossia is basically having two distinct versions of a language that exists within the same society. Think of it like formal wear versus everyday clothes. In this case, you have this formal European-based standard Portuguese, and then you have this more organic, everyday spoken language, the vernacular that we talked about earlier.
So you might use the formal version for writing, or maybe like a speech.
Exactly, or in educational settings.
But in everyday life, it's all about the vernacular.
Right. And what's fascinating is that both of these forms have a place in Brazilian society, which reflects the dynamism of the culture, but it can also get a little politically charged.
Really? How so?
Well, there's this ongoing debate about the status of the vernacular. Some linguists see it as this fully developed system that deserves respect, and others see it as almost like a corruption of pure Portuguese,
Oh,
a sign of like declining education standards.
that's really interesting. It's amazing how these discussions about language become about so much more.
Oh, yeah. It's about identity and culture and what it means to be Brazilian in the world today.
Exactly. Speaking of which, the Wikipedia article talked about how Brazilian Portuguese has really gained global recognition through things like music and television.
It's true.
It's almost like those mediums have allowed the world to experience the beauty and the uniqueness of the language in a very direct way.
Absolutely. You think about the global phenomenon of like samba and bossa nova.
Right.
Those musical styles are so interconnected with the rhythms and sounds of Brazilian Portuguese.
As soon as you hear it, you're transported to Brazil.
Exactly. And then you have the telenovelas,
Right.
these Brazilian soap operas that have captivated audiences all over the world. They've brought Brazilian culture and the sounds of Brazilian Portuguese into homes across the globe.
It's almost like the language itself has become an ambassador for the country.
Absolutely. It gives people a taste of Brazil, even if they've never been there.
It really speaks to the power of language to connect us and to open our eyes to different cultures and perspectives.
Beautifully said. And, every time we do a deep dive like this, it just reminds me of how much there is to learn about language.
It's true. It really is like this constantly evolving thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And with a language as dynamic and rich as Brazilian Portuguese, we've really just scratched the surface.
So to our listener out there, if this deep dive has inspired you, go out there and keep exploring.